Hey gang, and welcome to a Duelling Rabbits Productions video all about mitigation strategies for that common weaving occurrence, a broken warp end. It happens to all of us. We're weaving happily away when suddenly a warp end gives up the ghost and we are left with the prospect of a repair. Fortunately, there are a number of good options for making the procedure fairly painless, and in this video I'm going to cover some of my favorites, whether I'm weaving on a draw loom or any other kind of shaft loom. I personally favor methods where a repair yarn is tied onto the original broken warp end so that eventually it is incorporated back into the cloth. There are choices about particular ways to do this every step of the way. I like to think about the process in 4 parts: the setup, where we route the repair end through the reed and heddles, the connection of the repair thread to the broken end at the back of the loom, attachment of the repair thread to the web at the front of the loom, and the finishing of the repair when the cloth is off the loom. My approach to each of these remediations varies depending on the circumstances, so to illustrate, I'm going to use a number of projects, past and present. We begin by gathering our first aid kit. We will need 3 accoutrements to start with: a good length of our warp yarn, a reed hook, and a pair of sharp scissors. Whatever we choose to do down the road, the first part of the process is always the same. We need to get one end of our repair yarn back to meet its injured counterpart. We'll start in front of the reed. We begin by finding the dent that is missing an end. This is usually fairly obvious, but on the draw loom I find it's easiest to do if I raise the unit that contains the break. This narrows things down and makes it easier to find the victim. We mark the dent by inserting the hook and draw one end of the repair yarn through. We'll leave the repair yarn package in front of the beater and unwrap as much as we need as we go along. It's pretty typical for a warp end to break off in the vicinity of the reed or heddles. If the original warp end can be found in front of the heddles, we tie the broken end to the repair end with an overhand knot so it can be pulled back through the appropriate heddle without too much ado. Else, we need to hunt and peck to find the empty heddle and feed our repair end through without a guide. Either way, I think it's a pain to make the connection where all the loom's workings are, so I ensure my repair thread is long enough to reach further back on the warp where I have room to work. Now that both our repair and original end are out in the open, we have our first choice to make. How are we going to connect them so we can resume weaving? Sometimes the most attractive choice is to tie the 2 ends together with a knot and be done. I tie my knot in a convenient place behind the heddles but in front of the least sticks. You might think an overhand knot would be good enough for this purpose, but I have found that it isn't. The knot itself is kind of big, and I daren't cut the ends too short for fear of unraveling. If the ends are left long, they can tangle in the warp, restricting the shed. Some sort of super strong, virtually invisible knot is required. Fortunately for us, such a knot has existed for forever, the weaver's knot. Here's how I like to tie it. First, I take up the repair end in my left hand, leaving a little tail. Next, I take up the broken warp end and slide it behind the repair end so that both tails are pointing up. You can see that under my thumb the threads are crossed, with the repair end on top. Next, I take up the length of the broken end and pass it behind its own tail on the left. I then bring it between the tails and pass it in front of the tail on the right, which is the repair end. Now, I must somehow pass this tail through the loop I've just made. There are a variety of one-handed ways to do this, and true professionals have a clever rolling thing that they do with their left thumb. I'm not so proficient and have to lift it over with my right thumb and forefinger. Once I've done that, I grasp both tails in one hand and the original warp end in the other and pull the thing taut. It makes the tiniest, strongest knot in the world. Even better, I can snip the ends to microscopic proportions that will not tangle or get caught up in the heddles or reed. Once I've secured the other end of the repair yarn to the cloth at the front of the loom, I can continue weaving and my repair will seem but a dream. Here it is again. Repair end in left hand, broken end in right hand. Broken end is passed behind the repair end and held in place. The length of original warp is brought round behind the left tail and in front of the right tail. The right tail is passed through the resulting loop. The tails are pulled in one direction and the broken end in the other. The knot is pulled taut and the ends are snipped to oblivion. There are lots of good reasons to use a weaver's knot for a repair. It's fast, simple, and once it's tied, you can forget about it and weave without further issue. I use it for yardage and thicker yarns especially. It does have one major drawback though, the knot itself. Other weavers may disagree, but I feel all evidence of the knot needs to be removed once the cloth is off the loom. And for fine damask, this can be a particularly fiddly and irritating task. For my draw loom, I prefer a different way. Enter what I call the traveling bow, described by Ula Cyrus and employed by discerning weavers everywhere as an invisible repair. Here's how it works. We're at the back of the loom again. Here's the original broken end coming up from the warp beam and through the lease. Here's the repair end. Somewhere in here is the overhand knot I tied to bring the repair through the heddles. There it is. Now, this repair is made behind the lease sticks, so the first thing I'm going to do is pull the repair end through. You can see the knot as it travels through the lease. My repair end is going to take a bit of time to pull through. I want enough slack to reach the back beam and then some. When that's done, I snip the overhand knot, tying the two ends together. I now have two very long ends that I'm going to tie in a bow at the back beam. The bow can be tied further down, just above the warp beam, but I like tying against the corner in this way, as it allows me to control the tension of the thread a bit better. Because my ends are so long, when I'm done with this, I like to coil them neatly and lay them across the top of the warp behind the lease sticks. Once I've attached the other end of the repair thread to the cloth at the front of the loom, I can continue weaving and advancing my warp as normal. Eventually, though, this will happen. My lease sticks need to be pushed to the back beam to ensure a good shed. But if I do that, I will run them over my bow, which will then be in front of the lease sticks, interfering with the other warp ends. To combat this problem, I will untie the bow and move it back to where it was on the back beam. Now I can slide the sticks back and continue weaving. I will repeat this process for some time, moving the bow to the back as the warp is wound forward. As we proceed with our weaving, the repair end gets shorter as it is used up, and more of our original end unspools from the warp beam. After I've woven some more, I get to the point where my repair end is very short, and my original end, the one that was broken, will reach the cloth at the front of the loom. I untie my bow and tie the two ends together in an overhand knot behind the lease. By tugging on the repair end, I'll be able to draw the original warp end through the lease, the heddles, and the reed to the cloth at the front of the loom. You can see the original warp end coming through the reed now. At this point, I'll snip off the knot and the rest of the repair yarn and reattach the original warp end to the cloth, using one of the methods I'm about to demonstrate. The traveling bow is an elegant, invisible repair that leaves no knot in the weaving and requires only minimal darning at finishing time. It takes a little more effort to set up than the weaver's knot, and the bow has to be retied at odd times as the warp is advanced. Since draw loom weaving is a slow process anyway, this inconvenience bothers me not at all. Now, all this time we've been at the back of the loom, there has been a warp end waiting patiently in front of the beater, either the repair yarn package if we've just started the process, or the original warp end if we've retrieved it off the back beam with the traveling bow. Time now to attach it to our cloth. First up, the pin. This is the most common method and it works in just about every situation. We take our end and pull it taut, taking care to align it with the warp's original path. I take up my pin and insert it into the cloth exactly below the dent where the end emerges from the reed. I make sure to leave room for the temple. I bring the point of the pin back up through and wind the repair around the pin in a figure 8 several times. We've got either the weaver's knot or the traveling bow at the other end, but this is where we apply weaving tension, so it's important to get it right. This looks like a pretty tidy repair, so now I can get back to weaving. It won't be long before the pinned end is taken up by the weaving and disappears below the fell line. If it doesn't get caught up in the interlacement, chances are it has not been pinned in sufficient alignment with the thread's original path. But this one looks good to me, and I will call it a successful repair. This is the default method for attaching a repair end to woven cloth. It can be used with any warp and weft combination on any structure. It's quick and neat. There isn't really any downside, provided one is careful about not stabbing oneself with the pin and remembers to remove the pin before it travels down over the breast beam. Darning of at least one of the ends is required. Having sung the pin's praises, though, I must confess to using another method whenever possible. I call it the overlap twist. If my warp and weft yarns are the same, I can avoid pins and darning altogether. Here's my repair end coming through the reed from its attachment point somewhere at the back of the loom. Here's my broken end cut to a length of a few inches. This is the procedure. I twist the two ends round one another once and finesse the twist down towards the fell line. I open my next shed and feed both ends through it in opposite directions. An inch or two is enough. Then I bring both ends back through the ceiling of the shed so I can get good purchase on them. I weave a pick or two and then pull the ends tight against one another. I do it again once or twice more. The repair disappears as if by magic. I'll trim the ends when the cloth is off the loom. The great advantage of the twist is that it is a once and done repair with no darning required. Have you guessed? I really hate darning. The disadvantage is that it is only appropriate for projects where the warp is the same yarn as at least one of the wefts. Still, I use the twist whenever possible. When our repairs have been completed and our cloth is off the loom, we are on the home stretch, but not quite finished. Most of our fixes require at least some darning to hide their effects. It is much easier to darn in ends and splices before the cloth has been put through its wet finishing. First, the knot. Although some weavers leave the knots in their finished cloth, I cannot bear to do it. Sometimes on principle, sometimes because they're extremely visible. On this loosely set yardage, for example, every knot, and there were a lot of them, had worked its way to the surface before I even got the cloth to the table. You can see one of the culprits here in light blue. I like to take lengths that are a few inches long, thrums are perfect for this, and weave them in on both sides of the knot. Then I carefully snip the knot out of the cloth, leaving the overlap in place. Once the cloth has had its bath, such repairs are generally invisible. Darning the traveling bow. If you look closely, you can see that there is a gap before the repair end is caught up in the interlacement. Ideally, I like to close this gap by continuing the path of both the repair and broken ends so they overlap and there is no discontinuity. I make sure to leave enough length at the loom so that I can use the original threads in my repair. I darn in one direction, following the interlacement carefully, then flip the cloth over and continue the opposite way. Using these fine threads on this dense 6-end satin structure, the repair disappears even before I have wet finished the cloth. Now that my sewing basket is empty, I'm eager to get back to my draw loom and warp some very fine threads indeed for 6-shaft damask napkins. I hope you'll join me.